The talk topic for today is Why Leave, Why Stay? The Push-Pull of the US for Black Jazz Musicians. So the way that I'm going to organize this is I'm going to talk a little bit about my research from the book that you see out there, and you can kind of delve more into beyond my talk if you would like to after the talk, to my present work, Move Jazz, Black Woman Move, and what that has to do with why leave, why stay. I'm going to be talking a lot about this concept of a jazz diaspora and looking at two particular case studies, if you will. Sidney Bechet, whom you saw in the photo on the left walking up the stairs of Air France, and Angelique Kidjo, who you saw in the expansive photo with the backdrop of New York City behind her. So I will talk about them as kind of two case studies that really show, exemplify jazz diasporas, and also that I've approached this question of why would you leave the US and why would you kind of come back here and create your career here? So jazz diasporas, that's my first manuscript, and it focuses on, as Dr. Gillespie summarized, the years of 1946 to 1963, in which a big wave of African-American musicians, and not just musicians, but visual artists, writers, you name it, left the United States and made their home in France, not just France, but especially Paris. When jazz diasporas came out, it was kind of filling a gap in which there was really not a lot of attention to the jazz scene in Paris in the post-World War II era. I'm sure many of you have heard of the name Josephine Baker, right? Josephine Baker made her start dancing in Paris in the 1920s and 1930s and increased her repute over the years. But that era of the 1920s and 1930s, the jazz age, right, is written about quite a bit. Jazz diasporas went a little bit further and started again to fill that gap in terms of jazz historiography that had not paid attention to this kind of second wave of jazz that was coming into France. And it also explores the reasons that people would leave the United States, what they hoped Paris would offer for them, how they survived outside of the United States. Did they decide to come back? Things like that. So that's my first work. And my current work is drawn from that. So after I finished writing Jazz Diasporas, there were several questions that still kind of came up, but two of the primary questions were, one, where are all the women? So in chapter 3 of Jazz Diasporas, I have a chapter that explores the Paris Noir art scene in Paris of this time, and I use a guide. Her name is Inez Kavanaugh. She was a singer, and she was in Paris for about 7 years, and she was really at the heart of hosting musicians, of having her own club, and being the manager of that club, of really kind of boosting young artists and giving them a space in Paris. But there wasn't a lot of information on her. There are not a lot of kind of materials that still exist, so I could really tell her story. And I just thought to myself, I know a little bit about Inez, but there must have been other women who came through this site. Maybe not for 5 years or more, which was the criteria of this first study, but people who came through and they made their impact and nobody's written about them. What about their stories? So that prompted me to focus on Black women in particular, Black women jazz performers in particular for my current project. The second question that a lot of people asked me when they were hearing about my research for jazz diasporas was, what about other African diasporic people? So we know you focused on African Americans, but what about people from Western Africa, for example, or from the Caribbean? We know they were studying in these spaces. We know the type of music they were playing. Were they involved in the jazz scene? Well, in the 1950s, they weren't involved as much in the jazz scene because they're playing a different type of music, but also because there was a different perception of other African diasporic people in comparison to African Americans. So what I learned from my study, my first study, Jazz Diasporas, was that race matters when you travel, but also ethnicity and national identity matters in terms of how people perceive you, the type of experiences you're going to have. So with my current project, Move Jazz, Black Woman Move, I really wanted to explore other African diasporic people and make that connection with African Americans. Did they share the same challenges, the same survival strategies? What was their experience with performing in France? And I opened it up to look at not just France, but other Francophone sites around the world. So the kind of through line to my work is looking at the ways that jazz musicians and jazz music migrated from the United States to France and Francophone cities. And how was it potentially a survival mechanism for the performers? How did these performers help change this music as they went along? How did the national and racial identity of jazz change as it migrated to these different places? So just a little bit of background on the larger project. So this concept of jazz diasporas that I came up with is really central to these discussions. So there are two types of jazz diasporas. In one sense, jazz diasporas involve those who thrive and shape individual identity through musical collaboration outside of their homeland. So migration has prompted them, like jazz has prompted them to migrate. And what has their experience been? How have they made use of jazz in order to survive? That's one type of jazz diaspora, more individual. Another type is, in the second type of jazz diaspora, the music travels and through its interactions alters who performs, represents, and claims the music. With these two case studies I am going to talk about today, Sidney Bechet on the left, Angelique Kidjo on the right, they exemplify both. Both the individual who has gone from their homeland and whose identity has changed because of performing jazz internationally, and also they helped change the way that jazz was perceived. Sorry, I should have got all of these to show up at the same time. Okay, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on some of the primary reasons that people have left the United States. In my first book, In Jazz Diasporas, in chapter 3 especially, that chapter I mentioned with Inez Kavanaugh, and this is Inez Kavanaugh in Club Saint-Germain-des-Prés, actually, in 1950s. This is James Baldwin on the right. This is Kenny Clark, bebop drummer, on the top. These are some of the case studies that I explore in jazz diasporas, and I should note that when I talk about jazz, I not only talk about musicians, I talk about visual artists, I talk about writers, I talk about dancers, I talk about filmmakers, so it's an expanded notion of who performs jazz, right? In my study of these case studies and more, these are some of the primary reasons that they left the United States. Kenny Clark, for example, he had a really positive military experience in Germany. He also went to France, and when he came back to the US, of course, it was the exact opposite. And so he really wanted to return to that space. He and others benefited from the GI Bill, getting their education by returning to France and places like that. Some people dreamed of peace. They had this idea that maybe they could escape in some part a lot of the racialized conflict that they were experiencing in 1950s, primarily US. And for a lot of people, it was more job opportunities. So for Inez Kavanaugh, in one of the letters that, one part of her correspondence that I looked at, she said, jobs, everybody should come here. Like there's a strike, going on, in England. I know it's hard to find work in the US. Come to France, they've got jobs here. And that still seems to be a kind of current refrain, that there's a lot of opportunities, not just gigs here and there, but festivals. There are a lot of festivals in France, music-wise. Artist grants, socialized governmental benefits, freedom to date internationally. This was a big one. Do any of you know the filmmaker Melvin Van Peebles? Okay, so he made a film called 3 Day Pass in English. That's the translation in English, but he made it in France about an African-American soldier in France and all the things that he kind of gets up to on his 3-day break, right? And so this kind of encapsulates some of the, I guess, possibilities that African-Americans could explore there without fear of, being attacked, to their own detriment. You have also this perception that outside of the United States, there's greater respect for the music and more serious knowledge of jazz, that there are more serious fans, that instead of thinking of jazz as a music of entertainment, where you go in and you just get your dance on, that it's a music that really, deserves intense focus and takes practice. thinking of jazz as opposed to thinking of jazz as instinctual, right? Like improvisation means, oh, I don't have to practice, I just got it like that. But knowing that in order to improvise, it's based on, structure. So a different kind of respect and serious knowledge of jazz and Black artistry. Um, More opportunities to collaborate. So, for example, Kenny Clark collaborated with Hal Singer, who's a saxophone player, and they both lived in New York. And they were both just busy, had all these opportunities, but never had the opportunity to collaborate. So when they came to Paris, it was a smaller scene, and so they had more opportunities to do creative things. Artistic freedom, and also, and this is a big one, that Paris is this kind of stepping stone to other locations because of how close relatively everything is as compared to the US, where I was just talking to Dr. Gillespie about the distance between Virginia and here, like 10 hours, right? Like in 10 hours by train, I could get into like a couple other countries, from, France to, to the Netherlands, for example. So Paris was this kind of hub where you can get out to other places. So these are some of the core reasons that people left the United States, including Sidney Bechet. So a little bit about Sidney Bechet, but first I'll let you listen to a little of his music. That's Summertime by Sidney Bechet. Summertime is a Gershwin tune. It's one of the most popular, oft-recorded jazz standards. And Sidney Bechet's is one of the most well-known, primarily because of the way that he solos, the tone of his horn. He was a saxophone player and a clarinetist, and you see some of the kind of statistics about his life. But what is most stand out about Sidney Bechet is that he came out of New Orleans, right? He came out of the birth of jazz. He was a contemporary of Louis Armstrong, but many people don't know about him. How many people before today had heard the name Sidney Bechet? Before today, okay. So we got like maybe 8, 9 people, maybe 10 people in a room of, I don't know, maybe 35 or 30 or something like that. So a good third, which is great, because I usually see a lot less hands. And I also know that I'm in the South, so the likelihood of you having heard of him is a little bit higher. But yeah, he was right up there in terms of being one of the greatest soloists of all times, jazz soloists of all times with Louis Armstrong, but he's not as well known because he spent a good part of his career outside of the United States. And one of the important things about him is that he not only was like born with jazz, right, at the same time, he actually helped migrate the music. He was one of the first people to perform jazz outside of the United States in England in 1919, and he even performed for the Queen on the request of the Queen. And the first jazz review ever written about jazz was about his playing. So he is certainly a standout performer who helped disseminate jazz and move it from more of a quote unquote race music, as jazz was referred to a global music as we know it today. And he lived in France in the 1920s at the same time as Josephine Baker. He actually performed with Josephine Baker in a performance, and also the 1950s. And so my work, Jazz Diasporas, looks at his latter career in the 1950s when he became a king of jazz. And I don't use that term lightly. There's actually a jazz hot cover, jazz hot, or jazz haute, as they would say, is a major French jazz magazine that's been around almost as long as Downbeat by a couple months or so. So it's a standout jazz magazine, and in 1949 for the big international jazz festival, Sidney Bechet was on the cover with a crown on his head, and they deemed him the king of jazz. So he became the king of jazz visually and also literally when at his death, it was televised. There were like scores and scores of people. They really thought of him, Sidney Bechet. The French thought of him as their own king of jazz. So he died in 1959, and this Juan-les-Pins is south of Paris. The reason that I look at Sidney Bechet is because, again, he's a good example of this individual and collective sense of a jazz diaspora. And the ways that he his unique type of jazz diaspora has to do with, some people would call it code switching, right? I call it like performing these different subjectivities. So for example, in chapter 1 of Jazz Diasporas, you'll see kind of an analysis of the ways that Sidney Bechet has to survive when he's abroad. He's like, oh yeah, I'm French, I'm Creole, listen to my accent, I've got this in my background. Or, when the French are just like, oh, we're protecting you, you can't go back home because, there's so much racialized like conflict there, you're not safe. He was like, oh, no, I'm American. I would be back there if there were more job opportunities. So don't you think, that, you are protecting me in some way. And then there's also his desire for connection to his African homeland, right? This kind of romanticization of like going back to Africa. Like I moved to France. He has a chapter in his autobiography called Closer to Africa. And he says that he moved to France to be closer to Africa. So he kind of switches between these different modes, depending on the audience, to forward his success while he's living abroad. And he also demonstrates a kind of masculine, a hyper-masculine jazz diaspora, and really kind of shows the space for men in this jazz diaspora, jazz being still a very male-centric industry, both in terms of historiography on jazz, as well as the industry in terms of opportunity. So those are two of the things that I really kind of focused on in my analysis of his jazz diaspora. For the topic of today, really honing in on why he left the United States, why he was kind of pushed outside of the United States. The first reason are jobs. So in the 1950s, this great musician who, the first jazz review was ever written about, this great musician didn't have a job, didn't have a regular gig. He had opened like a laundry and a tailor shop, and he hadn't played in a while. And so this opportunity to come play at this international jazz festival, which I mentioned, came along. And given more time, I would talk about Sidney Bechet and his unique characteristics. And again, in the book, there's a kind of a detailing of this. But one of the reasons that it was especially great for him to be able to go back to Europe is because he was banned from going back to France. So in the 1920s, he got into a conflict with another jazz musician, a drummer. Fisticuffs, fighting, guns were drawn, and shots were fired, and a random bystander was shot, not killed, but shot. And he went to jail. He spent some jail time in 1920s, and he was therefore banned. So it says a lot about the French jazz culture, that they wanted him so much that they went to the judge and they got all this material and said, we really need this, this figure to be here for this festival. He contributes so much, like, please change the ban. And so he was able to do that. So jobs is one thing. Interracial relationships, I mentioned that a little bit earlier. Sidney Bechet married a white German woman at the end of his life and had a child. And their wedding, you see photos, you see scores and scores of people like lauding them. Again, 1950s, mid-1950s. This is not gonna happen in the United States, right? So he could live a life and be with a person that he couldn't be with, at least peaceably, in the United States. And recognition, that was a big thing, like I said, for other artists as well, but for Sidney Bechet, this recognition, because he had a kind of chip on his shoulder about Louis Armstrong. He's like, I'm just as good as him. I am just as good as him, better. He would say better. He performed not only in Louisiana, but went up to Chicago for a while, was in New York. He'd been all over the place performing this New Orleans style jazz. And in the 1950s too, there was a kind of revival of interest in New Orleans style and more kind of traditional jazz, and he was at the forefront of that. He could also play with some of more of the bebop performers. So he got that recognition in France and in Europe, but as we can see from the hands raised, it's still arguable whether that recognition exists even today. So those are some of the reasons that he left. Sorry. Okay, I'd like to shift to the other side of the question, and to my current research, and that is, why would someone come to the United States? What is the draw from coming here and performing jazz here when this is not your home? And so this gives us a little chance to think about Angelique Kidjo, who was born in Benin, which is in Western Africa. And some of the highlights about Angelique Kidjo are that she first left Benin because she wanted opportunities as a woman, as a Black woman. And the culture that she's coming from, there are not a lot of opportunities to be a musician and not perform for the state, perform for like the government, perform their different type of ideological messages that she didn't necessarily agree with. But there's also running away from hypersexualization, expectations of women, as a performer. So she went to France for job opportunities, for also to learn. So what got her to France was the jazz school there, and she got to learn jazz there. But one of the particular experiences that was distinctive for her, like that left an impact, was one of her colleagues mentioned to her, "What are you doing here? Like, you're African. Like Africans don't perform jazz." So you have these French musicians at this jazz school in Paris who have absorbed jazz and its history, which is like flourished, right, in Paris, since the days of Sidney Bechet. This is like late 1970s, early 1980s Paris. And so you've got these other French jazz students who are just like, we got this. We got this whole history of different performers bringing this music here, and it's ours too, but it's not yours. It's not yours as an African. You don't have any experience in this. So she very much pushed against that. She learned what she could from the jazz school, and she started to participate with a group called Pili Pili, and made a name for herself. And from there, why would she go to the US? So what does the US hold? She's become popular, well-known in France. Why go to the US? Well, the US is still, especially places like New York, the center of jazz. It's where jazz came from, right? If you want to get a career, you've got to kind of go there or go back and forth there and make a name for yourself. So that was the first draw. The second draw is that when she was there in Paris in the late 1970s and early 1980s, it was the beginnings of what we know as world music, right? So even though her colleagues were like, you can't perform jazz, she's just like, I'm gonna remake jazz, right? I'm gonna expand it. I'm gonna add some of the musics that I grew up with from Benin, some of the music that came to me, from like Southern Africa, like all these different musical influences that I got. It was never just like one genre for her. She was listening to James Brown, to like Nina Simone, to all of these like figures, and that really influenced her sound. So she was at the forefront of creating world music in Paris, and she took that and brought that to us in the United States. Another standout thing about her, and another reason that she would come to the US, is to make contacts. So one of the things about Angelique Kidjo, and you'll see this a little bit in the video that I show, is that she was really drawn to the suffering of other people of African descent when they were torn away from their African homeland through slavery, through the Middle Passage. And she explored that musically through her trilogy, Oremi, Black Ivory Soul, and Oyaya. And in that, you see her exploring the musics of the US, exploring the musics of South Africa, exploring the musics of Africa, like in these different albums. And going to the US, she was able to work with really well-known jazz musicians and R&B musicians as a part of this trilogy, which just expanded her network. So that was another thing, another pull of the US was to make these types of connections and to continue to expand. What is it that we think of jazz? What does jazz sound like? Maybe jazz can be more global. Maybe jazz already was global. And one of the last things is that New York City was a really big hub of music and still is. But for her, it's become this real site of influence. So, for example, I'm hoping to go see her at Carnegie Hall in March, like when she performs. And she's not only used that as her stomping ground to perform her own stuff. I think it was in October. She hosted an African Music Day where she brought in other Beninese like artists. So she has this influence at Carnegie Hall. She's just like, hey, you know, like give me a show, but also let me help sponsor other musicians. She is also used her music for political exposure, helping other Black women musicians, especially from Africa, but from all over the world, get a step up. I saw her perform in Montreux, Switzerland, a few years back, where again she hosted others' musical performances, and she danced on stage right with them. I mean, think about the credibility, you know, that gives some of these larger artists. And she also she's just like this global political figure who is using her music not just to kind of take with her and to make herself famous, but to connect these different strands of African diasporic experience and music together to provide a kind of a connective jazz diaspora. So those are some of the ways that some of the reasons that she was drawn to the U.S. Okay, so I'd like to show you a clip from a performance. When I was talking about my two book projects, I wanted to go a little bit into the methodology. So briefly, Jazz Diasporas is mostly historiography. Looked at a lot of archives and texts and things like that. And I did some interviews of contemporary musicians who've played with some of those musicians, like Sidney Bechet. But I also did performance work. So my background is in performance studies, which means that I believe that performance can tell us a lot about important cultural values, but I also believe that we can learn a lot through embodied knowledge of doing performance. And because of that, my first project, Jazz Diasporas, also contains performance work that I did about Sidney Bechet. It's hard to see it on the page, but the opening, you know, of my chapter on Sidney Bechet, the poetic opening, came from a script that I wrote for a one-woman show. So these different things that came from my performance really influenced Jazz Diasporas. In my current work, I'm wanting my performance skills to even more inform how I tell this story. So I'm using performance as a research tool in order to prompt questions that might not have come to me otherwise. But also, I hope I share these performances, and I hope at the end as well, I will have some type of performance of these different stories. So I give that to you as a little bit of a background because this performance occurred at Williams College Museum of Art a couple years ago, and it was for a dance colloquium. And so it was in a gallery space. And my idea was to share some of the ethnographic interviews that I'd done with Angelique Kidjo, the historical research that I'd done, and make connections between Angelique Kidjo's experience and what we know of jazz in the United States. This is a very short portion of that performance. Just to give you a frame, the performance started off with me kind of entering in as Angelique Kidjo as an intro kind of a voiceover, plays her music and discusses her background. And then I come to this bench, which you will see me on. I wrap these scarves around me, and I'm gonna play for you what happens next. How do we perform diaspora in the art? My father said, I was born a soldier of justice, with no weapon, but my voice, my voice, my voice, my voice. Since I was little, since pre-K all the way to high school, it just boiled my blood to see injustice. I just can't stand it. When I see a grown-up abusing anything or just any injustice, I will jump on your neck and I'll scream, yell, scream, oh, I'll scream, ah! So learning about slavery, learning about slavery and apartheid is something that really almost destroyed me completely as a human being. I know this is not possible because I could not put that together. But the fact that we are the same human family, yet we were able to do so much horrible thing to each other. So for me, at that point, I start singing about issues, about injustice. I started in 1997, a trilogy of albums switching back to the root of slavery through music. Because music brought the story to me. I have to complete the cycle. So the first part was America. So this performance really helped me in terms of thinking about Angelique Kidjo's unique jazz diaspora. Again, I took excerpts from the interview that we did together, and the interview excerpt that I chose was really about how she thought of her voice as like a political tool, and that her music was a political agent, a political force out there, not to divide, not to separate and say, in terms of African diasporic experience, my experience here is different than yours, or if you haven't had an African diasporic experience, stay away. No, it was to kind of use music to connect in the same ways that she does as a global ambassador. So her view of her diasporic experience was one that was connective and was using music to do that connection. I also really paid attention to Africa, and I don't know if I can go back a slide or two so you can hear one of her most well-known songs, so you can think more about the ways that she performs a sense of Africa. So try to play Africa here, which is her version of it. Okay. It was important to play that because one of the key parts of Kidjo's performance, if you've ever seen her perform live, is performing this often at the end of her performance, a kind of a bringing together of everything and walking through the audience, getting people standing up and performing and clapping and dancing with her. So a way, again, that she's performing her version of music, which is global, which includes jazz and R&B and all of these different types of music together to bring people together from different backgrounds, and not just to bring them together, but to bring them together in the sense of Africa, right? Africa, this mother bringing everyone together. She, in terms of her career, she really kind of challenged again what jazz music could sound like, and also what African music could sound like, because some people come to her and they're just like, this isn't what I was expecting to hear, this is too modern, or, and she's just like, all these labels, like, I'm playing good music, get up and dance, So her jazz diaspora, again, is not about these labels, but it's expansive and it's connective. And one of the really interesting things to me about her work that I'm exploring even more in this second book and performance project is how woman-centered it is. In terms of her political work and her foundation work with the Batanga Foundation in support of African girls and their education, she does it that way, but she also does it like musically. So you see the album cover, Eve or Ava, that's her mom's name. And so she was really inspired, by her mom, but also inspired by the first woman, Eve. And on this album, she again helped sponsor other women musicians to do collaborations with them. And I think about this work as well as I think about the ways that I can help share her experience of migration. I think her experience is very woman-centered. It is very connective. It is very connective of Africa and all of its expressions of diaspora around. So how can I think about my own positionality as a Black woman and how I connect, with her as well when I'm performing? Okay, so I guess the end goal, the big why does this matter, is that these two figures, Sidney Bechet and Angelique Kidjo, and a range of Black jazz-influenced musicians help tell us about the real power of jazz and other Black music to spread beyond the United States and to influence other people, but also not to stay static, right? So jazz is not just an American music. It is not just the quote unquote race music, how it started. It has become this global music. But global music, and this is one of the key questions that I had at the end of my book, Jazz Diasporas, when I was talking about Kenny Clark, for example, it was like, all right, so Kenny Clark, he's known for thinking about jazz as universal, making that like jump, from Black music to universal. What happens to all of the contributors, the African-American contributors and beyond, that poured their soul into this music and a lot of the time didn't get the money for it, didn't get the recognition for it. I have students taking jazz classes, 13 Ways of Looking at Jazz, and they were just like, wait, like I never knew that this was considered a Black music. I go and see a concert and there's no Black people playing jazz, right? So my question at the end of Jazz Diasporas was, if jazz is this universal and this global music now, has it lost its racialized history? And is that an important question to ask? Does it need to stay? Do we need to still have that? And so in my current work, I'm still exploring that question with the women. These Black women from all of these different Francophone spaces are going to these Francophone spaces. How are they using this music, and do they have some type of like obligation, or is it a part of their expression of the music to keep this racialized history a part of it? How are they doing that? Or, is jazz just this global music that has lost that? So another important thing about thinking about why these musicians leave and why they stay is what has happened to the identity and the expectations of jazz music as it's traveled. And is there a danger of having lost this history of it, of African Americans and African diasporic contributions to this music? And I find that with both of these figures, that jazz is still Black and global. It's both. And it's really great to like interweave, all of that. From Sidney Bechet, who was like taking this music for the first time outside of the United States to England, he made it global and it was still Black. And from, Kidjo now, who's like coming from Western Africa and is showing us, hey, there were these roots here in jazz already. Let's like break these up and let's mix some other genres with it and still keep jazz alive. So jazz is Black and global, and it's still very much alive, especially through the migratory experiences of musicians like these. Thank you very much.